dystopia warning, obviously. Now, it's not very often that I veer into American politics because, let's face it, things are mental enough in Britain. However, it's pretty difficult to ignore, not least because of the graphic snuff films that are circulating, the murder of far-right activist Charlie Kirk in Utah yesterday. I want to make a really important point right at the very beginning of this video. I don't condone political violence. I don't condone people being murdered. But I think it's really important to acknowledge, in terms of the aftermath and the response to this, that there is an awful amount of hypocrisy going on. Kirk was essentially a white supremacist. They call it Christian nationalists nowadays. White colonial powers built their empires on violence, land theft, forced labour, murders, slavery. Then they called the outcome civilization. And when that same violence was turned around on them, they referred to it as barbarism. Violence, it seems, is only legitimate when it serves the most powerful people, i.e., white rich people. If you build an order on domination, then those who are affected by it are going to inevitably resist. And today we are seeing the very same pattern. When politicians scapegoat minorities, when conspiracies about replacement theories are pushed, when politicians scapegoat migrants, when culture wars spread fear and suspicion, they're all fueling the same cycle. That rhetoric breeds hatred, and hatred breeds desperate responses. Violence is never the answer, but you can't spend years stoking fear and rage and suspicion and paranoia and then act shocked when people respond to the climate that you created. Now, I understand that not everyone's going to be aware of who Charlie Kirk was and what he stood for. And I also understand that it's perfectly acceptable to have a nuanced, varied view on this. You can think that political violence is not acceptable and that it's a very poor response to someone that you disagree with and condemn that. On the other hand, you can also be forgiven for not really feeling anything and not feeling any empathy for someone that spent his life making the lives of other people difficult, and a life that showed very little empathy for a range of people, from gay people to women to people of colour. I'm going to go through some of the things that Charlie Kirk was known for. He wasn't just a podcaster. He wasn't just a commentator. He was an extremist. Why? Because of the rhetoric, apocalyptic framing, racist conspiracies, anti-LGBT+ and misogynistic framing, and also his role in election denialism. His relationship with Trump was extremely close, and he was essentially Trump's youth movement propagandist, turning campuses into breeding grounds for MAGA politics and staying loyal after January the 6th. And this was done via Turning Point USA, which was essentially a radicalisation scheme for the youth. Their big sell was that the left is ruining your life. It was very anti-feminist, anti-migrants, included climate change denial. And they essentially framed rebellion as siding with the far right. Why did they do this? Because the right knew that it couldn't get by relying on the votes of the old forever, so they started targeting the young. They did this via kind of like meme warfare, targeting young people on TikTok. That's why a lot of young people are aware of who Charlie Kirk is. They were his target audience. And they did this by framing themselves as like an outsider voice to appeal to younger viewers that might be disillusioned by the reality of having hard right governments. And the problem is with this is that it pushes people directly into the radicalisation pipeline. A 17-year-old might start watching a Charlie Kirk or a Farage rant on TikTok and end up deep in the conspiracy pipeline within a very short amount of time because of the way that the algorithms work. And what we've got here is a crossover between Turning Point UK, Turning Point USA, and Reform. Reform are doing exactly the same thing because they don't have any original ideas whatsoever. And that's precisely why you've seen Farage coming out with a gushing tribute. The same Farage that's been pictured with rapist Conor McGregor and accused sex trafficker and rapist Andrew Tate. Because the veil of Christianity, traditional values, conservatism were used as a way to subjugate the rights of women and roll back the rights of trans people, gay people, people of colour, which kind of also hooks into that whole trad wife trend that we've seen. Very subtle ways for them to recruit and radicalise younger people into the far right. And not just that, when you look at it closely, the funding models are similar too. Reform UK, a right-wing populist party led by Nigel Farage in terms of donors. Well, they're importing Trump-style tactics there, seeking big donors, hiding donations in crypto, which covers up all that foreign interference. Hard targeting and money being poured into TikTok and other social media outlets, using think tanks that are actually not think tanks, but they're just mates or activists for reform, pretending to be credible think tanks. Turning Point UK did it more directly. GB News is essentially an experiment for the kind of extreme so-called news channels that you see in America. Reform and Turning Point UK are essentially trying to clone what Kirk, what Turning Point USA were doing. They want to claim the youth vote. Let's take a look at some of the things that Charlie Kirk said, shall we? And let's start off with the sexist statements. He made many comments about birth control, women's attractiveness, women's rights. He said birth control made women angry and bitter. He said that females over the age of 30 aren't attractive in the dating pool, and suggested that young women were suffering because they were focusing on work rather than having families. This is 1950s level shit. He promoted a model where women should see men as protectors and leaders, which marginalise women's autonomy and our diversity of purposes as entire human beings, not just fucking breeders. He condemned being gay at its very core by quoting Leviticus. He had opposition to gender-affirming care. He described progressive sexual or gender-based policies as sexual anarchy. And what about the racism? He once said, and I quote, "If I see a black pilot, I'm going to be like, boy, is he qualified." He called George Floyd, the murdered black man, a scumbag. He denied that there was any such thing as white privilege and made many comments about the Great Replacement theory. The conspiracy that, certain demographics are being replaced, mostly white people, by brown and black people. He said it wasn't just a theory, but it's a reality. It's okay to have a nuanced opinion on this. Someone's opinion on this is nuanced. Things aren't black and white, and we're falling into black and white thinking more and more nowadays. You can't summarise your views on Charlie Kirk in a tweet. Although the same people being attacked today for expressing any form of opinion on Charlie Kirk are the very people that he targeted and the very people that would be most at risk under a far-right government. Because this guy was instrumental in getting what most people broadly assume now is a paedophile and rapist into the White House. In fact, as Charlie Kirk was unfortunately facing this incident, not only was there an active shooting taking place on a campus in Colorado, but Trump's government were doing their very best to hide the release of the Epstein files. Kirk died as a consequence of the very gun laws that he defended, and his entire platform relied on radical messaging, authoritarian approaches, the same that cultivates a feeling of fear and panic and suspicion, and the kind that might prompt extremism as a retaliation. Does that mean that he deserved to face what he did? Nobody deserves to face that. But as I said at the beginning, when you cultivate a feeling of fear and panic and paranoia in people, or you target demographics and increase their risk of hate crimes, you're vastly increasing the chances that there will be a retaliation to that language. Nobody is obligated to feel empathy or express empathy. And one of the things that I find the most galling in situations like this is when people pearl clutch and become the morality police and tell the communities impacted by his language and his rhetoric that they must show empathy. That's not how it works. The only way you reduce the risk of this happening again is by ending the culture wars and the hatred. But just watch MAGA capitalise on it.